"There's no seat for you in the front row, Margaret," my daughter-in-law whispered as I stepped into the church where my husband's funeral was about to begin. Her voice was soft enough that no one else could hear it, but sharp enough to make my chest tighten beneath my black wool coat. I stood there for a moment, still holding my gloves in one hand, staring at the rows of polished oak pews covered with white roses and folded memorial cards bearing Daniel's photograph. 46 years of marriage, and somehow I had become an afterthought at my own husband's funeral. The sanctuary smelled faintly of lilies and candle wax. Soft organ music drifted through the room, while people spoke in hushed voices beneath the stained glass windows. Everyone looked polished and composed in dark suits and pearl earrings, carrying casseroles and sympathy cards as if grief could be folded neatly into proper behavior. I noticed Vanessa immediately. She stood near the front row in a fitted black dress, one hand resting possessively on Ethan's arm, while she greeted guests like the hostess of some elegant social event instead of a widow's daughter-in-law. My son barely looked at me. That hurt more than I expected. Vanessa offered me a tight smile and gestured toward the back of the church where a single folding chair sat near the wall beside the coat rack. "We needed the front rows for close family," she explained quietly. Then she glanced at the chair. "That seat should be fine for you." Close family. The words settled heavily inside my chest. I looked toward the front pew and saw neatly printed reserve cards placed on every seat. Ethan's name was there, Vanessa's parents, her younger sister and brother-in-law. Even two of Daniel's former business partners had seats near the casket. But nowhere, not in the first row, not the second, not anywhere near my husband's coffin, was there a place for me. For a second, I honestly wondered if maybe there had been some mistake. But deep down, I already knew there wasn't. This had been planned. Carefully, quietly, deliberately. I nodded once and walked toward the back without arguing. My heels clicked softly against the marble floor as conversations lowered around me. A few people gave me sympathetic looks. Others quickly looked away, embarrassed on my behalf. I sat down in the metal folding chair and folded my hands tightly in my lap. From where I sat, I could barely see Daniel's photograph beside the altar. My husband looked exactly like I remembered him before the cancer hollowed out his face. Strong jaw, silver hair, kind blue eyes that always softened when he looked at me. I swallowed hard and forced myself not to cry. Daniel used to tell me that dignity mattered most when people expected you to fall apart. So I sat there quietly while the room filled with people who somehow seemed more welcome in my husband's life than I was. Ethan walked past me once without stopping. Vanessa never looked at me again. The service began exactly at 11. Pastor Raymond stepped slowly toward the podium, carrying his Bible and a sealed white envelope in his hand. His expression seemed heavier than before. After the opening prayer, he looked down at the congregation, then directly at me. "Before we close today," he said carefully, "Daniel Whitmore left specific instructions for me to read a private letter aloud to everyone in this church." The room became completely silent, and for the first time that morning, Vanessa looked nervous. Pastor Raymond cleared his throat softly before unfolding the envelope in his hands, but instead of reading immediately, he closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if steadying himself. I noticed the slight tremor in his fingers. Across the church, guests shifted quietly in their seats. The organ music had stopped completely now, leaving behind only the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside the stained glass windows. Vanessa sat perfectly still in the front row beside Ethan, but I saw the tension in her shoulders. She kept adjusting the diamond bracelet on her wrist the way she always did when she felt uncomfortable. Ethan leaned toward her and whispered something I could not hear. She gave him a quick smile, though it did not reach her eyes. I sat alone near the back wall, staring down at the folded funeral program in my lap. Daniel had chosen that church himself almost 20 years earlier when we renewed our vows for our 25th anniversary. I remembered standing beside him beneath the same stained glass while he squeezed my hand and smiled at me like I was still the young woman he met in college. Back then, Ethan was just a teenager sitting proudly in the front pew with his crooked tie and nervous grin. It felt impossible that the same boy now could not even save a seat for his own mother. Grief does strange things to memory. Certain moments grow painfully sharp, while others disappear completely. Sitting there alone, I could still remember the smell of Daniel's aftershave drifting through our bathroom every morning before work. I remembered the sound of his slippers against the hardwood floor at 6 o'clock sharp every Saturday morning while he made pancakes in the kitchen. Even during the hardest months of chemotherapy, he still tried to keep those little routines alive because he said ordinary things were what held people together when life became frightening. But after his diagnosis, something in the family slowly changed. At first it was subtle. Vanessa began answering Daniel's phone for him. Then she started scheduling his appointments herself. She insisted she was only trying to help, and Daniel, exhausted from treatment, rarely argued. Soon Ethan stopped calling me directly. Everything went through Vanessa instead. If I wanted to visit the hospital, I had to ask her first. If I wanted updates about Daniel's condition, she delivered them in clipped little summaries that somehow always made me feel intrusive. One afternoon 6 months earlier, I arrived at the hospital carrying Daniel's favorite homemade chicken soup only to find Vanessa standing outside his room with crossed arms. "He needs rest today," she told me. "The doctor says too many visitors wear him out." Visitors. The word stung then, just like it did now. I had gone home that afternoon and cried quietly in the laundry room where nobody could hear me. Even Daniel noticed the distance growing around us. A few weeks before he died, he reached for my hand while we sat together in his hospice room, watching snow fall outside the window. His skin felt paper-thin beneath mine. "If they ever make you feel unwanted," he whispered weakly, "promise me you will wait before reacting." I remember looking at him in confusion. "What do you mean?" I asked softly, but Daniel only smiled tiredly and squeezed my hand once before closing his eyes again. At the time, I thought the medication was making him emotional. Now, sitting in the back of that church while Pastor Raymond held Daniel's final letter in his hands, I realized my husband had known far more than I ever understood. Pastor Raymond adjusted his glasses slowly and looked out over the congregation again. Then his eyes settled directly on Vanessa. "Daniel asked me," he said carefully, "to read every single word exactly as he wrote them." Vanessa's expression finally cracked. Vanessa lowered her eyes for only a second before recovering the polished expression she wore so well around other people. Anyone who did not know her closely would have thought she was simply grieving. But I had spent 15 years watching that woman smile through manipulation so subtle most people never noticed it happening. Pastor Raymond unfolded the letter carefully while guests leaned forward in silence. I could hear someone coughing softly near the side aisle, and the faint rustle of funeral programs shifting between nervous hands. Even the church seemed to hold its breath. "If you are hearing this," Pastor Raymond began reading, "then I am gone, and my wife is probably sitting somewhere pretending she is stronger than she feels." A few people smiled sadly at the line, but my throat tightened instantly. That sounded exactly like Daniel. Gentle, calm, observant. He always noticed things nobody else saw. Pastor Raymond continued reading slowly. "Margaret spent 46 years holding our family together. She sat beside hospital beds, balanced every bill during hard years, stayed awake during storms when Ethan was sick as a child, and somehow made every house we ever lived in feel like home." I stared down at my hands because suddenly I could not bear looking at anyone else. Memories flooded me all at once. Tiny apartments with broken heaters during our first winters together in Ohio. Daniel working double shifts after Ethan was born. Me clipping grocery coupons at the kitchen table while Daniel kissed the top of my head before leaving for work every morning at 5:30. We were never glamorous people. We built our life slowly, inch by inch, sacrifice by sacrifice. And for most of our marriage, I believed our son understood that. But somewhere along the way, Ethan changed. Or maybe I simply stopped seeing clearly. After he married Vanessa, family gatherings became performances where everything revolved around appearances. Expensive wine, perfect table settings, conversations carefully curated for social media photos afterward. Vanessa loved anything that looked impressive from the outside. Daniel noticed it long before I did. One Thanksgiving about 3 years earlier, after guests had gone home, Daniel stood quietly at the kitchen sink drying dishes while I packed leftovers into containers. "Do you ever feel like Vanessa treats family like a business merger?" he asked casually. I laughed at the time because the comment seemed absurd, but Daniel only shook his head slowly. "Watch carefully," he said. "She always positions herself at the center of every room." Once he became ill, that instinct intensified. Vanessa suddenly managed every detail of his care. She reorganized his medications into labeled containers. She answered questions before Daniel could speak for himself. When friends called the house, she often told them he was sleeping, even when he was awake beside me watching television. At first I told myself she was only trying to help, but then little things began disappearing from my life with Daniel. The doctor appointments I no longer attended. Financial papers Ethan suddenly handled instead of discussing with me. Family dinners where conversations stopped when I entered the room. One evening, I overheard Vanessa speaking sharply to Ethan in the hallway outside Daniel's hospice room. "Your mother is too emotional," she whispered. "Somebody has to think practically now." I remember standing frozen beside the vending machine, holding a paper cup of stale coffee while those words settled into my chest like cold rain. Practical. As if love and loyalty became inconveniences once illness entered the picture. Pastor Raymond paused briefly before continuing with the letter. "I also know there may be people in this room who underestimated my wife simply because she chose grace over conflict." At that, several heads slowly turned toward the front pew where Vanessa sat rigid beside Ethan. My son looked pale now, truly pale, and for the first time all morning, he finally turned around and looked directly at me. The moment Ethan looked back at me, I saw something I had not seen in his eyes for a very long time. Doubt. It flickered there only briefly before Vanessa leaned closer to him and whispered something under her breath, but the damage had already been done. My son shifted uncomfortably in his seat and loosened his tie as if the church suddenly felt too warm. Pastor Raymond continued reading Daniel's letter with the steady calmness of a man who understood the weight of every word. "Margaret has always chosen peace," he read, "even when others confused her kindness for weakness." A soft murmur passed through several rows near the front. People were beginning to understand that this letter was not simply a goodbye. Daniel was saying something very deliberate. Across the aisle, I noticed Daniel's older cousin Walter slowly lowering his head while his wife stared openly at Vanessa with narrowed eyes. They had visited our home often during Daniel's illness. They knew more than most people did. I sat perfectly still in my folding chair, though my heart beat so hard it almost hurt. Part of me wanted the floor to open beneath me so I could disappear from the humiliation of the morning. Another part of me wanted to stand up and finally ask Ethan how he could let this happen. But Daniel had always believed anger made people careless. "Never hand someone your dignity just because they forgot theirs," he used to say whenever family conflicts arose. So I remained quiet. Pastor Raymond unfolded the second page of the letter. "During the last year of my life," he read, "I spent many nights pretending to sleep while people spoke around me as though I could no longer hear. The church became so silent that I could hear rain beginning to tap softly against the stained glass windows. Illness teaches you uncomfortable truths," the letter continued. "You discover who sits beside your bed when there is nothing to gain." My throat tightened painfully. I remembered those nights. Daniel drifting in and out of sleep beneath pale hospital lights while machines beeped softly beside him. Me rubbing lotion onto his dry hands because chemotherapy had cracked his skin. Sitting awake at 3 in the morning timing his medications because he became nauseated if they were late. Ethan visited often during the beginning of Daniel's illness, but over time those visits became shorter. More distracted. Vanessa usually spent them scrolling through her phone or stepping into hallways to take business calls. Once, about 4 months before Daniel died, I walked back into his hospice room after speaking with a nurse and overheard Vanessa talking quietly near the window. "The house will be easier to manage once everything transfers," she whispered to Ethan. "Your mother cannot maintain that property alone anyway." I froze outside the door with my hand still gripping the paper coffee cup I had just filled downstairs. Ethan sounded uncertain when he answered. "Maybe we should wait before discussing that." Vanessa sighed impatiently. "If we wait too long, your mother will become emotionally attached to staying there." Emotionally attached. As though the home Daniel and I built together was simply a real estate issue to solve. I never told Daniel what I overheard that day. At least, I thought I had not. But now, listening to his letter echo through the church, I realized he had seen far more than I understood. Pastor Raymond paused again before reading the next line more slowly. "I know there may be people sitting in this church today who already made plans for my belongings before I even took my final breath." Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Vanessa's face had gone completely pale now, though she still held her chin high. Ethan stared down at the floor. Then Pastor Raymond lifted his eyes from the letter and spoke directly to the congregation. Daniel also left specific instructions concerning the seating arrangements for today's service. Every head in the church turned at once. Pastor Raymond slowly folded one corner of the letter between his fingers before speaking again. 3 days before his passing, he said carefully, Daniel personally met with me here at the church to discuss today's service. The sound of rain outside had grown heavier now, soft drops sliding against the stained glass windows while thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Daniel was very specific about one request. Pastor Raymond continued. He said the first seat in the front row must always belong to his wife. A sharp silence swept through the sanctuary. I felt every pair of eyes shifting around the room at once. Pastor Raymond glanced toward the empty space beside the casket where Vanessa's mother currently sat clutching her purse tightly against her lap. Daniel asked me to place Margaret beside him, Pastor Raymond said. Personally, Vanessa's face lost what little color remained in it. She turned toward Ethan immediately, her lips parting slightly as if searching for something to say. Ethan stared at her in stunned confusion. I do not understand, he said quietly, loud enough for several nearby guests to hear. Vanessa told me the church changed the seating yesterday. Pastor Raymond shook his head gently. No changes were ever requested by the church. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Small ripples of whispers spread through the pews. I noticed Walter lean toward his wife, while several people exchanged uncomfortable looks. Vanessa straightened quickly, forcing a strained smile onto her face. There must have been some misunderstanding, she said lightly. Everything was happening so fast. But her voice sounded thinner now, less controlled. Pastor Raymond looked directly at her for a long moment before unfolding the final page of Daniel's letter. Daniel also included this sentence specifically for today, he said quietly. Then he read aloud. If Margaret is seated anywhere other than beside my casket, then the people responsible have already proven everything I feared. A woman near the middle pews gasped softly. Ethan slowly turned toward Vanessa again, but this time there was no confusion in his expression, only disbelief. You told me Mom preferred sitting in the back, he whispered. Vanessa immediately grabbed his arm. Ethan, not here, she hissed under her breath. But the damage was already spreading through the church like cold wine through an open door. I sat frozen in my folding chair near the wall, unable to move. A strange numbness settled over me. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just exhaustion. For months I had questioned my own instincts, convincing myself I was imagining the distance growing inside my family. I told myself grief made people behave strangely. I told myself Vanessa was stressed. I told myself Ethan would never intentionally push me aside. But Daniel had seen it clearly all along. Pastor Raymond carefully lowered the letter onto the podium. There is one more thing, he said. Daniel left written instructions that if Margaret was not seated in the front row, I was to stop the service until that mistake was corrected. The church became completely still again. Then slowly, almost awkwardly, Walter stood from his seat in the second row. His wife stood beside him. Without saying a word, they both stepped aside. A moment later, Daniel's former business partner rose quietly as well. One by one, people in the front pew began standing and moving toward the back. No arguments. No protests. Just silent understanding. Ethan looked as though someone had pulled the ground out from beneath him. Vanessa remained seated for several seconds longer before finally standing too, though her expression had hardened completely now. Pastor Raymond stepped down from the altar and walked toward me himself. When he reached my chair, he offered me his hand gently. Margaret, he said softly, your husband saved this seat for you. And for the first time since entering that church, I realized Daniel had never intended for me to sit quietly in the back at all. My legs felt unsteady as I stood from the folding chair, but Pastor Raymond kept his hand gently beneath my elbow while guiding me toward the front of the church. The sanctuary remained completely silent except for the rain tapping softly against the stained glass windows. Every step down that aisle felt unreal. People moved aside quietly as I passed them, their expressions shifting from pity to something else entirely. Shame, perhaps, or understanding. I did not look directly at Vanessa while walking toward the front pew, but I could feel her eyes following me. Daniel's casket stood beneath white lilies and soft candlelight near the altar. Up close, I noticed the small details I had missed from the back of the church earlier that morning. His navy blue tie was the same one he wore at Ethan's college graduation. The silver watch folded beside his hands was the anniversary gift I gave him 10 years ago after he survived his first heart surgery. Suddenly, my chest tightened so painfully I had to stop for a moment beside the pew. Pastor Raymond squeezed my arm gently. "Take your time," he whispered. I lowered myself slowly into the front row seat Daniel had saved for me. My seat. The realization settled over me quietly, almost heavier than the humiliation from earlier. Because Daniel had known. Somehow, during those final weeks while he struggled to breathe and everyone treated him like he was fading away, my husband had still seen exactly what was happening around him. Ethan remained standing near the aisle for several seconds before finally sitting beside Vanessa again. But the distance between them had changed now. He no longer leaned toward her. He no longer held her hand. Vanessa sat rigidly with her purse clutched tightly in her lap, staring straight ahead at the altar without blinking. Pastor Raymond returned to the podium and unfolded the final portion of Daniel's letter. "There is one last truth I need my family to hear," he read carefully. "Illness strips away performance. It reveals character." I closed my eyes briefly. Daniel used to say things like that late at night, when we sat together on the back porch watching summer storms roll across the neighborhood. Even after 46 years of marriage, he never stopped studying people quietly. He noticed patterns, silences, small cruelties hidden beneath polite smiles. I think part of him tried to warn me long before I was ready to listen. About a year before his diagnosis, we hosted Christmas Eve dinner at our house like we always did. I spent 2 days cooking Daniel's favorite maple glazed ham, homemade mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and pecan pie from scratch. The house smelled like cinnamon candles and pine from the tree in the living room. But halfway through dinner, Vanessa casually announced that starting next year, she thought holiday gatherings should rotate between homes because our house felt a little outdated for entertaining. Everyone laughed politely at the time, even me. But later that night after guests left, Daniel stood quietly at the kitchen counter rinsing dishes while snow fell outside the window. "Did you notice how she said our home like it was already temporary?" he asked softly. I brushed the comment aside then because I did not want conflict. I always believed keeping peace inside a family mattered more than winning arguments. But peace built on silence has a cost. Eventually, you begin disappearing inside your own life without even noticing it. Pastor Raymond continued reading. "Margaret loved this family without conditions," the letter said. "If anyone ever made her feel unwelcome after I was gone, they were never protecting this family. They were protecting themselves." A low murmur spread quietly through the church again. Ethan lowered his head into his hands for a moment, while Vanessa sat perfectly still beside him, though her jaw had tightened sharply now. Then Pastor Raymond reached beneath the podium and lifted a second sealed envelope into view. The entire room froze again. "Daniel instructed me," he said carefully, "to deliver this document only after his letter was read aloud in full." Pastor Raymond held the second envelope carefully in both hands, as though he understood its weight extended far beyond the paper itself. The room had changed completely now. Earlier that morning, people spoke in hushed, polite voices, exchanging sympathy and casseroles and awkward smiles the way Americans often do at funerals. But now the church felt tense and exposed, as though every hidden conversation from the past year had suddenly been dragged into the light. Even the rain outside seemed louder against the windows. Vanessa finally broke the silence first. "I do not think this is appropriate during a funeral service," she said sharply, rising from her seat before anyone else could speak. Her voice echoed slightly through the sanctuary. Several people shifted uncomfortably. Ethan looked up at her slowly, surprised by the sudden edge in her tone. Pastor Raymond remained calm. "These were Daniel's instructions," he replied gently. He was very clear. Vanessa forced a quick smile toward the congregation, but it looked brittle now. "Of course," she said lightly. "I simply mean this should probably remain private for family." At that, Walter gave a low, humorless laugh from the second row. "Seems like Daniel already decided who counts as family," he muttered quietly enough to sting. Vanessa's expression tightened immediately. I sat motionless beside Daniel's casket while all of it unfolded around me. Strangely, I no longer felt embarrassed. Earlier, sitting alone in the back row, humiliation had wrapped itself around my chest like heavy chains. But now something else settled inside me instead. Clarity. I thought back to the final month of Daniel's illness. One afternoon, while Vanessa and Ethan were downstairs speaking with the hospice coordinator, Daniel asked me to open the small drawer beside his bed. Inside was a leather folder containing insurance papers, old receipts, and a photograph of us standing beside our first house in Columbus back in 1982. We looked impossibly young in that picture. Daniel smiling proudly in a denim jacket while I held Ethan as a toddler on my hip. "Keep this safe," Daniel whispered weakly. "There are things people may try to rewrite after I am gone." At the time, I thought he meant financial matters. I never imagined he meant the story of our family itself. Pastor Raymond carefully opened the second envelope. I noticed Ethan watching him now with complete focus, his face pale and exhausted. Vanessa remained standing beside him with her arms folded tightly across her chest. "This document," Pastor Raymond explained, "was prepared by Daniel's attorney 6 weeks ago." The sanctuary became silent again. "It contains amendments to the Whitmore Family Trust." A sharp inhale moved through the room. Vanessa immediately turned toward Ethan. "This is ridiculous," she whispered urgently. "Your father was heavily medicated during those weeks." Ethan did not answer her right away. Instead, he stared down at the folded papers in Pastor Raymond's hands as though seeing his father differently for the first time. Pastor Raymond continued calmly. "Daniel specifically requested this amendment be announced publicly if Margaret was ever excluded, diminished, or treated as an outsider during funeral arrangements or estate discussions." My heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. Vanessa shook her head quickly. "This is some misunderstanding," she said. "Nobody excluded Margaret." At that moment, Walter slowly pointed toward the folding chair, still sitting alone near the back wall beside the coat rack. Nobody said a word after that. They did not need to. The empty metal chair said everything for them. Ethan closed his eyes briefly and rubbed one hand across his forehead. "Vanessa," he said quietly, "did you remove Mom's name from the front row?" She hesitated, only for a second, but after 15 years around her, I knew that silence meant guilt. "I was trying to keep things calm," she answered finally. Ethan stared at her as though he no longer recognized the woman sitting beside him. Then Pastor Raymond unfolded the final page of the trust amendment and spoke the words that changed the entire room. "Effective immediately," he read carefully. "All authority concerning the Whitmore estate, including the family home, transfers solely to Margaret Whitmore." The moment Pastor Raymond finished reading those words, the church seemed to lose all sound. Even the rain outside faded into the background. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I looked down at my hands resting quietly in my lap because suddenly they were trembling again, not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming realization that Daniel had protected me even after death. Vanessa stared at Pastor Raymond in complete disbelief. "That cannot be legal," she said, sharply, her voice rising before she caught herself. Several people near the aisle exchanged uncomfortable glances. Ethan looked exhausted now, like a man waking up slowly from a very long dream. Pastor Raymond remained calm. "Daniel's attorney prepared the amendment personally," he replied. "It was signed, witnessed, and notarized according to state law." Vanessa opened her mouth again, but no words came out this time. For the first time since entering that church, she looked frightened instead of confident. Ethan finally stood from the pew and took a slow step away from her. It was such a small movement, but after 15 years of watching my son orbit around his wife's opinions, it felt enormous. "You told me Dad never changed anything," he said quietly. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. "Because he was sick, Ethan. He was emotional. Your mother manipulated him during hospice." The accusation landed heavily in the room. A few months earlier, hearing those words might have broken me, but now they only made me tired. Daniel and I had spent nearly half a century building our marriage through layoffs, illnesses, mortgages, disappointments, and ordinary Tuesday nights folding laundry together in front of the television. We did not need dramatic declarations to prove our loyalty to each other. Our entire life had already done that. Ethan looked at me then, truly looked at me, and I saw shame settle across his face slowly. "Mom," he whispered, but his voice cracked before he could continue. I did not answer right away. I thought about the last Thanksgiving Daniel was healthy enough to carve the turkey himself. The kitchen smelled like rosemary and butter, while football played softly in the living room. Ethan laughed at something Daniel said, while Vanessa rearranged place settings because she wanted photographs to look symmetrical before dinner. At one point, Daniel caught my eye across the kitchen and smiled quietly. It was the kind of smile that only exists between people who have survived decades together. Comfortable, certain, safe. Later that evening, after everyone left, Daniel stood beside the sink rinsing dishes while I dried them. "Promise me something," he said suddenly. "If life ever becomes lonely after I am gone, do not beg anyone to treat you with love." I laughed softly at the time because the conversation felt unnecessary. "Daniel, stop talking like that," I told him. But he only shook his head gently. "People reveal themselves slowly," he said, "especially when they think you have become powerless." Sitting beside his casket now, I finally understood every warning he tried to give me. Pastor Raymond carefully placed the trust amendment back into the envelope before stepping down from the podium. "There is more," he said quietly. The room stiffened again. Daniel also included one final condition regarding the estate. Vanessa immediately looked up. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing himself. Pastor Raymond unfolded another sheet of paper and continued reading. "Any family member who intentionally isolates, humiliates, or attempts to remove Margaret Whitmore from the family home forfeits all future financial distributions from the Whitmore Trust." A sharp gasp escaped from somewhere near the middle pews. Vanessa's face drained completely of color. Ethan looked stunned. Then Pastor Raymond read the final sentence slowly and clearly enough for every person in that church to hear. "My wife spent 46 years building our family. Anyone willing to erase her does not deserve what she helped create." The silence afterward felt heavier than grief itself. Nobody stood up after Pastor Raymond finished reading Daniel's final condition. The church remained suspended in a silence so complete I could hear the faint ticking of the old clock near the back entrance. Vanessa slowly lowered herself into the pew again, but the confidence that once seemed to follow her everywhere had vanished completely now. She stared down at her hands, blinking rapidly as though trying to regain control of a situation already slipping away from her. Ethan remained standing beside the aisle for several seconds longer before finally turning toward me. I had never seen my son look so lost. Not when he failed his first college exam. Not when he lost his first job after graduation. Not even the day Daniel received his diagnosis. There was something different about this expression. This was the face of someone realizing too late that he ignored the wrong person for far too long. "Mom," he said quietly again, but this time the words sounded heavier. Honest. Painfully small inside the enormous sanctuary. I looked at him for a long moment without answering. I wanted to tell him how many nights I cried quietly in the laundry room after family dinners where I felt invisible. I wanted to tell him how humiliating it felt asking permission to visit my own husband during hospice care. I wanted to ask him when exactly he stopped seeing me as part of his life and began seeing me as an obligation Vanessa needed to manage. But grief has a strange way of burning unnecessary words away. So instead, I simply nodded once. Ethan's eyes filled immediately with regret. Vanessa looked up sharply at him then. "Ethan, do not do this here," she whispered urgently. But he slowly stepped away from her again. That tiny movement seemed to say more than any argument ever could. Pastor Raymond carefully placed Daniel's letter back inside the envelope before closing his Bible. "Daniel loved his family deeply," he said softly to the congregation. "But he loved truth more than appearances." Several people lowered their heads after hearing that. I noticed Walter wiping his glasses quietly while his wife reached for his hand. Near the middle pews, one of Ethan's childhood friends looked openly uncomfortable, probably remembering every holiday dinner where I smiled politely, while Vanessa slowly positioned herself at the center of everything. It amazed me how many people had noticed pieces of the truth all along without ever speaking about it aloud. Pastor Raymond stepped down from the altar and approached me one final time. He handed me Daniel's folded letter carefully. "He wanted you to have this immediately," he said gently. The paper felt warm from his hands. I traced Daniel's familiar signature near the bottom of the page and suddenly remembered a summer evening nearly 30 years earlier when we sat together on our back porch after Ethan fell asleep upstairs. Fireflies drifted across the yard while Daniel drank iced tea. Beside me in an old lawn chair that creaked every time he leaned back. "One day," he told me quietly, "I hope you understand how much strength there is in staying kind inside a world that rewards cruelty." At the time, I laughed because the comment seemed overly serious for such an ordinary night. But Daniel always understood people more clearly than I did. I rose slowly from the front pew and looked one final time at the casket surrounded by white lilies. Then I turned toward the aisle. Something unexpected happened as I began walking toward the church doors. One by one, people stood. Quietly. Respectfully. Not for Vanessa. Not for appearances. For me. The same people who earlier watched silently while I sat forgotten beside a folding chair were now stepping aside to let me pass through the center aisle with dignity restored. Ethan moved toward me carefully. "Mom, please," he said softly, his voice shaking. "I am sorry." I stopped beside him long enough to touch his cheek gently the way I used to when he was little and frightened after bad dreams. "Your father loved you very much," I said quietly. "I hope one day you learn why he protected me." Then I continued walking toward the church doors alone, carrying Daniel's letter against my chest while rain poured softly outside. And for the first time since losing my husband, I no longer felt erased.